Hello and welcome to another episode of the Silk and Steel podcast. I'm your host, Carl Za. Everyone, we have back on our show Dr. Warwick Powell from Australia, who is an expert in geopolitics and specialized in China. And we have so many topics to talk about, Dr. Powell, because as you mentioned, it seems like the last time we talked, I think it was only 2 weeks into the first month of 2026. It already felt like a half year had passed, and now it feels like a whole year had passed, and we're barely through January. Is there anything you like to start? Because there's so many to talk about.
Look, it might be worthwhile just doing a quick recap of the year that's been. Right? I mean, the 4 weeks that has been, right, and probably the most significant events, and we might kick off from here, from when we last caught up, is Davos and what happened around Davos. So prior to Davos, Mark Carney, the Prime Minister of Canada, made a visit to China, and in some regards, undertook what is a reorientation, a volte-face, a strategic realignment, or what have you. But what was probably most important out of that was a recognition by Carney that the environment for Canada had changed so much and so permanently that a fundamental strategic readjustment was needed. So whatever was going on around Canada was no longer viewed as a temporary issue. It was an issue of structural significance. And that's amazing because the United States not only has a land border with Canada, a very long land border, and one that has been peaceful for a long time, but is also the destination for about 70% of Canadian exports. It's also integrated into complex supply chains, right? So motor vehicles that are assembled in America often have parts that go backwards and forwards as they make their way through production systems in the most efficient way to ultimately become a motor vehicle that drives off the lot. And so untangling all of those things and putting all of those issues on the table, in a sense, at risk, in a year when the Canadian, American, and Mexican trade agreement, originally inked by Trump version 1.0, that's up for rediscussion 6 years on, right? So all of this is in flux. And for Mark Carney to take the view, and clearly it wasn't a rash decision, it was a considered intervention to say, look, we can't go on the way things have been going on. We need to recalibrate our economic relationships. We need to diversify for the long-term interests of the Canadian economy. We need to reduce our export dependency and risks on one market alone. And China is going to be important for that. And it's important because Canada has agricultural products to sell. Canada also has energy to sell, right? So Canadian oil has been growing in terms of its export profile with China. And in the medium term, Canadian LNG is likely to also become available for the global market as the infrastructure is finalised. On the other hand, Canada clearly is looking to transform its economic foundations with new technologies, in particular EVs. So having played along with the United States on tariffing Chinese EVs for a while, that changed as well. Not in a huge way. You know, I mean, the quota level is almost 50,000 vehicles, right, in a market that takes almost 2 million cars a year, right? So we're not talking big. But what's important about this is the symbol or the signal that Canada is now open for business, and that it wants to talk earnestly and seriously about collaboration, meaning some trade, but in the end, Canada is looking for opportunities to bring Chinese know-how and capital into the Canadian market to build the industries of the future for Canada. I think that's pretty interesting, right? And then off he trots to Davos. So he goes from Beijing to Switzerland. And and delivers, this speech. Now, for people in the West, it was a speech for the ages, because it, in some ways, it said what people in the global South have known for decades, right? That the global international order, the liberal rules-based international order, actually only worked in the interests of a small number of countries and a minority of the world's population, and that it was also over. So it was an obituary, firstly. But the second thing was that it was also, it wasn't a mea culpa, but it was a recognition that Canada had been a significant beneficiary of what was a lie. Okay, so Canada was a beneficiary of a system that hid behind a facade. And the reason why his speech was significant wasn't because suddenly somebody had a revelation about something unknown. It was because someone from inside the club belled the cat. Right? Could you imagine somebody who's been a beneficiary of this set of arrangements for decades suddenly breaches the code of silence, the pretense that this club was actually, in the interests of everybody, that this liberal international order was good for the world, when of course, in fact, it was good for some, but not always good for some. And eventually a breaking point has appeared. So I think that that's interesting, that Carney essentially broke ranks. But I don't think he broke ranks by himself. He didn't break ranks in a way that surprised anyone else. He broke ranks in the context of pressures that had been building, not only economically, but geopolitically, around issues like Greenland. Right? So the Greenland issue, I think, was almost like the geopolitical straw that broke the camel's back, that basically said, look, this alliance thing, it was okay whilst everyone else was the target, right? It was good to be in the club whilst we were extracting resources and exploiting everyone else. But my goodness, we've now become the target ourselves, and that's not on. So Carney coordinated this with Macron, with Merz, with Starmer and others. And within hours of his speech, the social media from all of these Western capitals was pumping out the message. Right? So I think it was a coordinated response in a way to say to the North Americans, to Washington, look, enough's enough. This has just gone too far. Now, the thing is about that, Carl, is that I don't think this is suddenly a road to Damascus type of conversion amongst the global North, the secondary, the two I.C.s of the global North. Right? What it is, though, is a recognition by the two I.C.s of the global North, the two I.C.s of the American Imperium, that no matter how much loyalty they display, no matter the fealty and the amount of daddying and all of that, that daddy ultimately could treat them like rubbish when and if daddy felt like it. And that was a shock to the system. And so they now talk about this idea of middle powers. Right? Notice it's not about global multipolarity and all those things. It's literally the global North sub-imperial 2IC saying, we've got to band together. We've got to hold our nerve now, because the country that we basically ran behind all of these years has turned on us. And so whilst I think it is revelatory that someone from inside the club belled the cat, it's not the road to Damascus discovery that perhaps some people would like to think it is. So it's an interesting time, isn't it?
Yeah, indeed. And following on, we saw EU. Von der Leyen went to India, and EU signed actually a groundbreaking trade deal with India. Of course, this is everybody understood. This is a response to Trump, and India and the EU that have agreed to broadly lower tariffs, going both directions. And interestingly, EU never raised the issue of India's purchasing Russian oil this time. Because whenever they talk about their relationship with China, they always talk about, talking down to China. It's like you are an enabler of Russia. You are an enabler of war, and this is why this is a huge impediment of progress between our bilateral relationship, because you are enabling our enemy. And this time they said nothing of the sort, because to be understood, both EU and India has been under enormous pressure under the new Trump tariff, and this is so yeah. In a way, Trump is a shaker and maker of this world. He's making a lot of things happening.
Look, I think Trump is contributing to globalization 2.0, actually. So rather than contributing to the destruction of globalization, what he's doing is he's accelerating a new chapter of deepening networks, which are actually multipolar or multilateral, and sometimes bilateral as well. So, the Canada-China reconfiguration. Interestingly enough, Carney didn't talk about China being a great enabler either, right? So suddenly all of these things that were impediments one day are inconvenient the next and are no longer ever mentioned. It tells us something about the nature of politics. But this EU-India trade deal is very interesting because it's been 2 decades in the making. It's a serious trade deal in that it didn't just happen over the back of a napkin. It wasn't the von der Leyen Trump meeting in Scotland, which announced big numbers but actually had nothing to back it up. It was a substantial set of agreements that had been negotiated for a long time at an official level, bureaucratic level. The fact that it had come to pass now is obviously catalyzed by what's going on in terms of transatlantic relationships and disruptions of global trade generally. The second thing that's interesting about it is that it comes on the back of an agreement that the EU entered into with the South or the Latin American countries only a week or two earlier, or just before Christmas. So in the space of a month, as you say, what feels like a year, but in the space of a month, the EU has executed free trade agreements with Latin America and India. So that's that piece. The other thing about this is that India itself has been incredibly reluctant to enter into free trade agreements because of domestic political concerns, mainly in the agricultural space, but also in terms of protecting other industries. So the politics of the effects of trade opening has always weighed heavily on Indian administrations over the course of the last so many decades. So much so that, as you'll recall, sitting there in Southeast Asia, that 6 years ago when ASEAN pulled together after many years of negotiations, this regional comprehensive economic partnership, the free trade agreement for the ASEAN member states, plus China, plus Japan, Republic of Korea, New Zealand, and Australia, to become what was the world's largest free trade agreement. India was actually involved in all of those discussions until the day the signatures were due, and India backed out. It was concerned about the effects of these agreements on Indian agriculture, on Indian farmers, etc., etc. I get the politics of all of this. Handling all of this stuff is difficult. So India's always had a protectionist streak, but there's India signing up, right? India also quietly, about 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, dropped restrictions on Chinese companies bidding for Indian government projects. Very quietly, no big deal. Now, those restrictions have been in place for 5 years, but they got dropped because they needed the capabilities and the know-how of major Chinese engineering firms basically to come and build infrastructure that India actually needs for its own economic development. So India itself is starting to, under some pressure, both domestic and also internationally, to have to find new pathways. And what I think is interesting about what's been going on is how countries that had resisted some of these decisions for quite some time, I think people like you and I might have said, some time ago, they're going to have to deal with this. This is unavoidable. These issues are just going to keep pressuring them. And of course, they ignored it. They didn't want to deal with it, make the big choices. But force of circumstance, is so powerful that in the end they have to do something. And I guess some people will criticize them for being slow to the party, but at the end of the day, reality is a very powerful force, and it is remarkable that the European Union, the Brussels leadership, and the coterie of national leaders that backs them up, forgot to talk about India buying Russian oil, that Mark Carney didn't mention, China's supposed role as the great enabler, and they're all now having to get on with reconfiguring their own positions with themselves, because this partly goes to the issue of who on earth are we, doesn't it? So suddenly, we were the 2IC of the American Imperium. We've now realized that the American Imperium is going to treat us like dirt whenever it feels like it. It was okay when we treated everyone else like dirt whenever we felt like it, but now that it's turned on us, we don't like it. And they're having to reconfigure themselves. This is a very, very fluid moment, potentially dangerous, but nonetheless one in which the seeds, I guess, of accelerated multipolarity, globalization 2.0, as I sometimes call it, are well and truly in place.
I think you actually have raised the issue that for Europe to achieve true independence, they need to achieve energy independence. And right now, since they have been cut off from cheap Russian energy, they have been increasingly reliant on the very expensive LNG import from United States. And so there's an urgent need for Europe to find alternative source of energies. If they're serious about reducing their dependency on the United States, you can't be claim that you're going to be independent of US when you depend on US for energy, like the basis of your civilization. Go ahead. Sorry.
Well, no, look, and this goes to the heart of it, because 3 years ago, firstly there was the sanctions, right? We're going to cut off Russian gas, etc., etc. And that's been a slow unfolding process. Then, of course, Nord Stream got blown up, and it really forced the hand of European industry to find alternative sources. And, surprise, surprise, one of the major alternatives to Russian gas was American LNG. Now, LNG shipped across the oceans is not cheap. It's a hell of a lot more expensive than LNG shipped via pipe. So it's a more expensive product landed. And that, of course, has flow-on effects on industry, on households, etc. And we know what they are. Right? But we're now reading reports, in of all places, the Financial Times and other mainstream Western media publications, where European leaders are saying, I think we've become a little bit too dependent and exposed to American LNG, and we're going to need to do something about this. Right? I mean, I don't know whether to laugh or to cry sometimes when you read this sort of stuff, because it's not as if it wasn't predictable. But in any case, there we are. The European leadership is now coming to grips with a reality that they themselves made in the name of, the Ukraine, Russia, and all those sorts of things. They cut themselves off. They bragged about how they were weaning themselves off Russian gas. That's the politics. And how they're going to be, we're going to be independent of that. The Russians, who, despite the fact that they've never cut our gas off, hold us over a barrel. We're now free of that. Aren't we good? 3 years later, the reality of being held to ransom by American LNG is dawning on them. Now, what do they need to do? Well, they ultimately need to have as quick and as low cost a pathway to energy sovereignty as possible. Now, that's going to involve a diverse range of energy sources. I don't need to buy into the debate about renewables versus hydrocarbons and all of that. I don't really care. Right? Bottom line is that whatever is engineeringly feasible and financially viable basically is what they need to do. And in part, not entirely, but in part, that's going to require fast tracking a massive amount of sovereign energy capability by way of buying renewable energy technologies from China. Surprisingly, not. We now have a number of European states, including the UK, talking about massive wind projects. Ironically, coming off the back of President Trump's speech at Davos, which talked about how the Chinese do nothing but sell wind turbines, but he's never seen one in China anyway. Actually, I can imagine in April when he visits China, you'll remember that when President Macron visited China a few weeks ago, President Xi took him to Sichuan and showed him the major irrigation projects, right, as an example of Chinese historical interactions with nature. It wouldn't surprise me if a part of President Trump's trip will see some meetings set against the backdrop of wind turbines. For a bit of atmosphere, because I think that that folk in Beijing will be concerned that President Trump is under the misapprehension that China only sells wind turbines but doesn't use them themselves, and I'm sure they would like to ensure that President Trump is not misled by others and their misinformation. So this would be a great way of making sure that that was the case. So the Europeans are going to need to do that.
But Dr. Powell, how would you respond to the U.S. Commerce Secretary Lutnick's claim that why would we even need to invest in so-called sustainable energy when here in the United States we have plenty of hydrocarbons, we have gas, we have oil, we have everything we need. Why do we need to invest in solar and wind when we already have oil?
Well, if I was the Europeans, the first question I would be asking now is the extent to which I can maximize my sovereignty, my energy sovereignty. Right? That's actually the big question, not whether or not Russia's got lots of gas or the United States has lots of gas. They both do. But what pathway do I need to forge to ensure that I am in the strongest energy sovereign position I possibly can be? It doesn't matter what Lutnick says. Lutnick's proposition is contrary to advancing the interests of energy sovereignty in Europe. So they conflict. So, yeah, look, Lutnick's got plenty of LNG. They want to sell lots of it. I get that. Right? But it's inconsistent with a priority around energy sovereignty. So at some point, the oil and the water don't mix, right? So the Europeans, if they want to reduce their dependency on the United States, and they clearly do, right? They clearly have come to the recognition and the realization that that exposure that they now have is far greater than they really want, right? It actually creates risks. They need to shift. Now, they can get LNG from other places, of course. Australia is one of the countries that could sell them some LNG as well. So that's a plug for the Australian LNG industry. But in the end, they also need to invest in other kinds of technologies. As I said, I don't need to buy into the argument about renewables versus hydrocarbons and all of that. The European engineers and others can make their own decisions on it. But it seems like that one of the critical issues is not only engineering feasibility and financial feasibility, but whether or not it contributes to energy sovereignty. And if it doesn't contribute to energy sovereignty, you need to have a very, very good reason why you're doing something. And so I think we're going to see, obviously lots of wind, some solar. We'll probably also start to see in Europe, again, the hastening or the acceleration of projects around some new nuclear capabilities. They would be well advised to speak to folk in China about that as well, given that they're not going to speak to the Russians about anything, right? Take that as a precondition. So they'll speak to the Chinese, who are developing some very interesting modularized or small format solar nuclear capabilities. And in the longer term, I think the Europeans are also starting to look at a more pragmatic attitude to bringing Chinese know-how and capabilities to be operational in Europe itself. And so we have Merz, for instance, talking about needing, or Macron talking about more Chinese investment in Europe, right? So again, reality begins to assert itself. Europeans ultimately, need to have resources and capabilities in their own arena. Some of those knowledges and technologies have to come from elsewhere. Work with the people who've got them, build your own capabilities and your sovereign infrastructure, and give yourself the best shot. The other interesting one, by the way, Carl, again, going to this question of sovereignty, is shifts in the information architecture environment, right? So one of the very interesting things about the AI space is that there's been a massive amount of downloads of Chinese open source AI models in Europe, right? So very significant number. So if you go to Hugging Face and looked at their data, you'll see that a very large number of downloads have been made from Europe. In other words, European entrepreneurs and others are experimenting a lot using Chinese open source AI, but they're not commercializing them because at the moment, the regulatory arrangements in Europe favor private models, proprietary models, because someone can be held to account for them, whereas open source models you can't be, right? So the corporations want to be able to essentially push off responsibility to the proprietary model provider, and that at the moment is actually holding the Europeans back from really taking advantage of the downstream potential of downloading and running Chinese developed AI models. So it's an example of the struggles that the European Union faces as it seeks to become a power in and of itself, as opposed to being an appendage of a transatlantic power structure.
Wow, how the table have turned, because the flow of technology and capital used to be the other way, from the west to the east.
Yeah.
I remember the first nuclear reactor in China was actually set up as a joint venture between France and China in the Pearl River Delta. And now, as you mentioned, China has leapfrog ahead. They have done some great research on the thorium nuclear reactor, which offer great potentials, and same goes for AI, of course. You right now, the only game in town in terms of AI is really Chinese and American. And by Chinese and American, you have to keep in mind, even in United States, most of the top AI talent are Chinese. So there are also ethnic Chinese. That most of the world's top AI talents are, they're not even Chinese who are born and raised in America, but Chinese who graduated from Chinese universities, straight out of mainland China. Yeah, and speak of energy, EU and India. I remember there's a viral post that going around on X. Someone was talking about how India has leapfrogged ahead on electrification of the country. But what it omits to mention is that it was possible only because the affordable Chinese solar panels have made it possible for India to gain rapid adaptation.
Yeah.
And it's also because India has a really weak energy infrastructure to begin with, so they now can just more easily switch to embrace the solar based energy grids.
I saw that report, Carl, and it was very interesting because it tried to do two things. And look, at a certain level, I think that there's some merit in the story, in that it talked about the electrification of India and the electrification of India by way of clean energy, and it then and that's happening. It then compared India's current process and rate of clean energy electrification with China 2012. And it did that on some methodological argument to say, well, that's roughly the comparable economic development levels. But of course, it's the wrong baseline because in 2012, the cost of clean energy systems was considerably higher than they are today. But be that as it may, it also tells us something about the dynamics of, again, of how Indian domestic politics, in a sense, plays its way out through these sorts of processes, because it would actually be much easier in a certain sense for India to just say, look, we actually just, again, because we've got issues in our own electricity network, our most effective pathway to electrifying the country is rapid scale microgrids, right? Not big poles and wires, but lots of microgrids, tackling user bases of 20 to 50,000 people, or big industrial estates or what have you. And the best way to do that is turnkey solutions out of China. And that's what we're going to do, because the end outcome, right, the end outcome is, again, a distributed energy network, which is very resilient, and enhanced energy sovereignty for a country. So, but the politics of India means that it kind of just has to do these things on the quiet. I guess that's what it is. But look, if the end result, Carl, is that a place like India is able to successfully electrify and deliver stable electricity across vast swathes of the country, that's great for people, and it's great for industry as well. And if India can accomplish that, it will, help consolidate the processes of global multinodal development or multipolarization. And I think when you're dealing with a country of 1.4 billion people, now the largest country in the world, many of whom continue to live in poverty, I think we should all be cheering on those efforts, and because those efforts will also spill over into the economic development of Southeast Asia, Central Asia, and as that process unfolds, it also lays the groundwork for reduction of economic stresses, which contributes to cross-border tensions, and hopefully creates the economic base for a more functional set of security architectures, right? So we start to intertwine energy, security, and prosperity. A bit like what the SCO is starting to do, by the way. Right? So the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, was essentially a security network sharing information, dealing with terrorism, extremism, etc. And at its last meeting late last year, the famous meeting in Tianjin, they actually announced a whole bunch of collaborations on energy and transport, right? So, because there's an understanding that you piece these things together and it actually creates a fabric, and a fabric really does tie the participants together in ways where their interests are co-constituted, and it reduces the reasons for there to be conflicts and reduces the amount of space in which third parties can try to niggle away and create tensions and conflict as well. So, I certainly hope that India is able to fast track its electrification, and because that is the foundations of its own development.
But why would Trump, like a lot of these changes we saw in the first month of the January is essentially being pushed by Trump policies. But why would Trump sabotage some of these most important relationships for United States? For example, U.S.-Canadian relationship, which has always been very close and mutually beneficial. A lot of U.S. companies that move production to Canada precisely to take advantage of the cheap Canadian energy. Canada has a lot of cheap hydro power, and they also have the tar sand. And why did Trump throw a wrench into that relationship? I can understand Trump's move toward countries like Venezuela, right? Trump's move toward Venezuela, and now he's pressuring Mexico to also cut oil shipment to Cuba. It's basically he's trying to starve out Cuba to this is energy. He's using energy like hostage. He's taking Cuba hostage by cutting off the two most important source of energy for Cuba. One is Venezuela, one is Mexico. He's trying to starve out Cuba, maybe causing regime change, which has always been a policy goal of United States government for a long time. But why Canada? Why is he going after Canada?
Look, there is something very unusual about this in that it defies conventional rational explanation. But it goes back also, remember at the beginning of this second term, President Trump talked very explicitly about absorbing Canada into the United States as the 51st state. He then, of course, has extended his territorial ambitions north to Greenland, and there is ongoing discussions about American, what is essentially de facto territorial control over parts of the Latin American continent, particularly those towards the north. So the Trump administration does have a sense of territory as part of its immediate jurisdiction of direct authority. So that's the first thing. I often say it reminds me of a dog marking its territory, right? And I get the sense that there is a little bit of that in all of this. The second thing is that I think President Trump actually has a very clear view about what he believes are the fundamental causes of the problems that America faces today. We can put aside what he thinks the problems are for the time being, but the principal causes are essentially twofold. One is that third-party countries have been taking advantage of America, right? They've been free riders, whether it's Europe in relation to defense, whether it's China in relation to trade, and whether or not it was Canada and Mexico also in relation to trade, right? All these American companies took good American jobs and things and took them over the borders. So there's a sense of America being a victim to these countries, and American benevolence has been taken advantage of, and Trump's going to put an end to that as well. Then, of course, there are the domestic enemies, right? Whether it's cultural Marxism, whether it's wokeism, whether it's this or that, right? But there's whatever it is domestically that aligns with a particular sense of what it is to be genuinely American. And so, what's the policy response? Well, the policy response is largely a violent lashing out and an attempt through the imposition of force or the threat of the imposition of force to get your way. And so many of these things could easily, I think, have been accomplished without any public displays of force in potential. There wasn't a need to bloviate about anything for America to massively increase its presence and de facto control over Greenland, for example. I suspect it could have been accomplished with about 2 or 3 phone calls. Right, that would have happened very quietly, and all that people would know is that there's just a few more planes flying troops and equipment into Greenland, and that's about it. In other words, the United States could have accomplished all of its so-called strategic objectives really without any of the soft power expenditure that he's had to go through. But I tend to think that by and large, President Trump is a reflection of a body politic, an elite structure that is experiencing a chronic case of displacement anxiety, and that the only tools that they know, because let's not forget, 35 years of American primacy institutionally strips you of the tools that you need to navigate a more complex environment where bullying your way around is not possible, right? So there isn't anybody institutionally that actually works at a senior level that was raised professionally in an environment where diplomacy was needed. None, right? I mean, when the Berlin Wall came down. And then when the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, we're talking 35 years ago now. So if you're 65 today, you were 30 at that moment, beginning of a career. What skills did you develop from the age of 30 to 65? Or if you're not quite retirement, you're 60. You were 25 when all this happened. You were an intern at the State Department. What skills and knowledges and frameworks that you developed in the intervening 35 years? Well, what you developed was a clear sense of American primacy and an ability to boss people around. And from time to time, a belief that your benevolence was being taken advantage of. You didn't learn anything about how to deal with people who weren't your friends, but nonetheless you had to deal with them. How do you, frame interactions with others that you may consider to actually not have interests entirely aligned with yours? None of those skills exist anymore. And so all that they're left with is belligerence. Can't hear you.
That does not bode well for for America's intermediate future. I mean, in the long term, there might be some process where America can sort itself out, but in the next 3 years at least.
Look, it's a human capacity issue, Carl, isn't it? Right? Because if you think about the transformation in industry at the same time, and the consequences of what's happened in the American education system. Again, I'm not even going to go near why. Different people have their own theories. But one thing we do know is that literacy and numeracy levels today are lower than they were 40 years ago. Right? We know that American institutions do not graduate anywhere near the number of people in all sorts of knowledge and skills areas that places like China do. Now, China, of course, is 4 times larger than the United States, but it's graduating not 4 times more graduates in STEM, but about 8 times more, 9 times more, right, on a per annual, maybe even more than that now, right? So there's something that has come that's lost its bearings in the human cultivation system, and so we see a response to that by way of enabling highly skilled people to migrate. You touched on that earlier. All the Chinese-born and educated graduates now working in American AI, and of course, the many people from India with skills who have come to take on many job roles, which of course creates its own political problems, right? Which we've seen, but you don't turn around a population skills and knowledge and literacy deficit in 3 years. This is a 30-year problem now. So we've got a 30-year hollowing out of the diplomatic corps. There is no culture of diplomacy. There is no competency in terms of what it means to be a diplomat, as opposed to being essentially a belligerent, defender of the realm. There's insufficient number of people with the right levels of technical know-how to really take on the opportunities and the needs in robotics, AI, biopharmaceutical research, etc., etc. There's just not enough, and this will mean that America either has to import more people again, and for that to successfully happen, it's going to need to become a more attractive place again for people from other parts of the world. And at the moment, it's not that attractive. It's a little bit ugly, right? So people are a little bit shy of going to the United States for pretty obvious reasons. So you've got to deal with that in the short term. But the long term is the structural question of, well, how do we turn this slide of foundational literacy and numeracy around? And you're not going to do that in 6 months. And you don't do that by abolishing the education department at a federal level either. Right? It's a complex problem because education is very distributed in the United States, and it's a big place. Lots of states, lots of counties, and so education is a big challenge. But rather than being the peace president who bombs 10 countries, President Trump, could have left an incredible mark on North America if he became the education president. Right?
I'm sorry, I have to laugh, but well, Trump is often being mentioned as a transactional president. Like he's described as seeing everything as transactional. He is scheduled to head over to China in April. Do you think he is possibly looking to work out some sort of a grand deal with President Xi Jinping?
He'd like to sell the idea of a grand deal. Whether or not it's grand and whether or not it's a deal that sticks is going to be a different question, right? But you can be sure that whatever it is, from an announcement's point of view, it will be the biggest and the best thing that's ever happened. But the issues are not insubstantial, right? There's obviously trade issues, but I think trade's actually a symptom of something else. Trade is often the one that's held out as the big bogeyman. We're being taken advantage of, et cetera, et cetera. But trade's really just a function of the distribution of productive capabilities. And if the United States doesn't sort out its own productive capacity issues, some of which relate to its pool of human capability and know-how, then rather than trade, yeah, sure, you can get your trade balance down substantially by trading less, right? That's just a function of math. But that doesn't necessarily mean you're improving the quality of living of your citizens or expanding your capacity domestically. America can't enhance its manufacturing industry, which incidentally has seen declining employment over the course of the last 10 months, continuing to, and reduced output, without importing raw materials, intermediate goods, and capital equipment from China. It needs to do that. The fact that the US dollar's dropped 9-10% in the last 12 months actually makes that all more expensive, right? So whilst that theoretically boosts exports and dampens imports, by dampening imports, it's actually making it more expensive for American industry to modernize. You want robotics, a lot of that's going to come from China. And if it's not from China, because you don't want to deal with China, you're going to need to buy it from Japan, Korea, or Germany, right? So if the US dollar's falling, all of that's going to cost you more. You want smart stuff going on in your industrial reorganization. You actually need a strong dollar to make that cheaper. So there are some contradictions now in terms of how US monetary policy and foreign exchange policy is working in the name of all sorts of objectives that don't align. The objectives of closing the trade balance question, the objective of reindustrializing America. People think just by reducing imports, you're going to help reindustrialize America. Well, you're not, because you need all these imports to do that. What does the grand bargain look like? I know people talk about, particularly some recent materials from the National Defense Strategy released by the Department of War, and comments made in the last day or two from Elbridge Colby, right, an assistant secretary in the Department of War, which doesn't explicitly talk about Taiwan. Right. And so there's a lot of excitement about that. Is this America throwing Taiwan under the bus? The fact that TSMC has agreed to spend more money building more fabs in America opens the question of, Taiwan's silicon shield being slowly but surely taken away and reducing the economic imperatives for America to be there for Taiwan. But people forget that from mainland China's point of view, Taiwan's not a bargaining chip. It's not a transactional piece. Taiwan's an intrinsic part of the nation. It's not to be bargained with. It is to be reunified with. And it will be reunified, hopefully peacefully, but in ways that are not compromised by the idea that it got traded. You don't trade sovereign territories. Certainly not if you're Beijing. So the idea that there'll be a grand bargain around Taiwan, I think, is deeply misunderstands how Beijing itself would view that proposition. It would see that really as a very insulting idea anyway. So what's left? Well, does President Trump secure Beijing's commitments to get some of its EV companies, for example, to set up factories in America? So he's talked a bit about this, right? When he was in Detroit during the campaign, he talked about the bloodbath. If we just let Chinese EVs enter America, and therefore, let's get them to set up factories here employing Americans. Well, theoretically, that's not a crazy idea, right? The Europeans are doing it, right? Canada's doing it. So the idea of doing this isn't mad, but there's so much that President Trump would need to do to give comfort to Chinese investors that they're going to be safe, not just economically, right? But that the assets are physically safe, that the people will be safe, that Chinese workers who go to help set up the factories will be safe, that there'll be an environment that will be welcoming, right? All of this is actually very difficult at the moment to deliver. And so I think there's a huge amount of work that needs to be done. So if there is a grand bargain, and this isn't really a prediction, I'm actually hopeless at predictions, right? But if there's a grand bargain, it may look something like a grand framework.
Okay,
right? So,
please elucidate.
Well, and the framework is that these are things that we'll work on. And we're going to have processes by which we build confidence around things. So yes, in principle, there is an agreement in principle to facilitate more Chinese direct investment in North America. But to make that happen, we can't just have a handkerchief deal, right? We're going to need to set up working groups. We're going to need to set up high-level working groups that involves Congress, right? Because Congress has so many hawks there that it's always a risk, right? People talk about transactions around reducing the barriers for American technology exports and all of that. Look, China's reached a point where it doesn't see that as a necessity, but it sees it as a matter of principle as well now, which is, look, there shouldn't be these sorts of barriers to trade, right? That's not what should happen. You complain about our company's not buying enough from you, and yet the things that we would love to buy from you, you've made it impossible for the last 6 years, to a point where we actually make our own now. So we don't need it, but there should be no barriers there. Just as, we can look at removing non-tariff barriers on Chinese exports to North America. They're the sorts of things that you can do that appear a little bit transactional, but what that starts to look like is a free trade agreement, right? And that starts to push Washington back towards this idea of participating in free trade environments. If it does that bilaterally, and that's difficult to do, right? But China's committed to open trade. So is that a deal structure? Difficult, right? People to people, I think, is always easy. And there are things around research and development collaboration where part of the grand framework can deal with, right? There's so much stuff going on in agricultural research, in science research, in health research, in bio, in nanotechnologies that should be shared, that should be built collaboratively. But we're going to need better frameworks again, given the treatment of Chinese researchers on the back of the Department of Justice campaigns over the years. So what are those reassurances, right? How do we make those concrete? So a grand framework creates a pathway, creates intent, and then it needs to have micro steps in the right direction. The trade negotiations over the course of the last 8 months, I think, tells us something about a style and a method, right? Step by step, incremental, do something to prove your sincerity. Make sure you lock that in. Then we revisit things, etc., etc. And I think that that's probably not a bad outcome if that could be achieved. Whether or not, and by the way, I think that could be sold as a grand deal, but it will but a cynic would say, well, yeah, look, it's not really quite the grand deal, but nonetheless, it's a framework that actually stabilizes things again. But that's still a tall order. They've got a few months to pull it off. Look, I'm not sure, for instance, that threatening to block Iranian oil is necessarily going to help in getting towards the grand bargain. I know there are people who say, well, that'll bring leverage. I think what President Trump should probably realize by now is that that approach to leverage tends not to work with Beijing. People in Beijing don't respond well. They kind of arc up. So other styles of approaches are going to be necessary. So let's fingers crossed. I mean, I do hope that we can get a little bit of calm around all of this. I'm not convinced we will, but let's see.
Let's focus on China for a moment. China has broken another trade record. It recorded $1.2 trillion of trade surplus. It feels like just yesterday we were talking about China breaking over the $1 trillion trade surplus. And then the Chinese prime minister went to Davos and said, China didn't go out to create these trade surpluses. China's goal is actually aimed to be the world's largest market. Now, how do you think China could do that to become the world's largest market?
Well, it can become the world's largest market by continuing to raise real incomes. And it continues to raise real incomes by having the most productive and efficient industrial sectors in the world, right? Because that's the basis upon which you can justify real increases in wages. And when it does that, it will naturally become the world's largest consumer market by virtue of sheer numbers. But you can't be the biggest buyer of stuff if you don't have the income. And to get the income, you need to have industry, because it's from working in industry that you create the productivity that sustains wages. So when And you'll notice, and we touched on this, I think, last time around or the time before, there's a whole bunch of commentary in the West that focuses solely on this issue of consumption. And China's approach, and you read this, whether it's in Xi Jinping's documents or other documents and comments made by senior government ministers, that this issue of consumption is intimately intertwined with the issue of productivity and production. You can't have one without the other. You can't have a consumption economy if you don't make things to satisfy the consumption economy. And you can't have a production economy if you don't have the consumption, right? So these things are intimately interrelated. So when he goes to Davos and says, we want to be the world's biggest market, that's actually a natural consequence of the economic development model by virtue of the fact that China has 1.4 billion people. So as real wages rise, the sums will lead to a reality that China is the world's largest market. The question then is how does the world take advantage of that market? And that's going to require some work, because market access into foreign markets is a complex problem. Macroeconomists sort of at a certain level of visibility, very far from the ground, only see how the big numbers move. But to make that happen, you've got to have products sitting on a shelf that people want at the price point that people want. They've got to be attractive. They've got to be interesting. And to get them onto the shelf, you've got to have a transport system. You've got to be able to get them through customs. You can't have them sitting on the wharf for 3 days, 4 days. You've got to move through customs quickly. For that to happen, they've got to be properly labeled and the paperwork's got to be in order. Increasingly, for that to happen with China, you've got to digitalize your supply chain systems, because China's moving down that path. Who's got that in place? So we're going to need to get that in place. Then you're going to need to make sure the ships can move and that everything in a container is almost pre-approved before it leaves the originating port. That means sharing data across boundaries. That means having to consider issues of commercial sensitivity, data sovereignty, data privacy. How does that sharing actually work? So suddenly we go from the high level of saying, yep, we've got a lot of people who want to spend money on stuff, to how do we make that all happen? The upside is that Chinese, being the sort of engineering-minded folk that they are, have also been working tirelessly on the ground across the world, building that kind of infrastructure. Things to be able to put containers on ships and move them easily. Things to be able to label things properly. Data infrastructure that can begin to share data in credible ways. Digital financial infrastructure to enable payments to happen quickly, smoothly, safely and cheaply. So slowly but surely, through the Belt and Road Initiative and other things, this entire ecosystem is emerging that enables China to actually fulfill the promise of being the world's biggest consumer market.
What about the criticism from mostly Anglo media that, okay, well, you say you want to be the world's largest market, but you have 1.2 trillion trade surpluses, and you aim to make everything yourself. So where does that leave room for the rest of us? There's nothing that you don't buy anything from us. You only expect us to be a consumer of Chinese goods. How is it sustainable?
Well, there's a couple of points. Firstly, China does import stuff, right? So people often forget that China actually is a big importer of things. Second point is that this explosion of the trade surplus, in large part, coincides with expansion of trade with the developing world. And much of that relates to China's exports of plant and machinery, semiconductors, renewable energy technologies, solar PVs, not sodium batteries, lithium-ion batteries, and EVs. Pretty high value stuff. But interestingly, when you look at all of that stuff that's being exported, it is technically enabling capabilities, right? You don't export plant and equipment if the recipient isn't planning to make things. So over time, as the productive capacity of companies in these other countries enhances, they will actually start to make things themselves. So that by nature will actually reduce some of the things that they already import from China. The second thing that is happening now is that Chinese companies are setting up factories in other places, and that is likely to accelerate. In part, it's going to accelerate because the RMB valuation is rising, which of course is what some of the critics always want. They literally say that Chinese exports are competitive because the RMB has been undervalued. Well, the US dollar is coming down, the RMB is going up, but the flip side of the RMB going up is actually two things. One is that the things that it does import will become cheaper, which will feed into its supply chain systems anyway. And secondly, it makes it more cost effective for Chinese companies to invest in things overseas. I personally think that that's a good thing by and large for that to happen because it takes expertise and capacity into other parts of the world. But I can imagine that the same critics who complain about China exporting things will eventually complain about Chinese companies investing in mines and building factories and all those things because they won't employ enough locals. They will ignore environmental or local labor laws. I say this because these are the sort of things that you hear already, and are somehow stealing local jobs or what have you. But there'll be a complaint. So in that sense, China can't win anyway. But we're going to see an expansion of domestic productive capacity in all of these places as a result. So over the next 10 to 15 years, those dynamics will change again. Now, that's the first thing. The second thing, though, is that there's a bunch of stuff that countries across the world do and make available that are actually incredibly attractive to Chinese consumers in China, but also to Chinese consumers who travel. Right? So the idea of increasing tourism visitations, for example, from a growing Chinese middle class, is a great way for countries to effectively earn export revenues. Right? That's an export. Education services is another one. Right? It's been a huge part of American exports to China. Tourism, this is prior to the last 12 months. Education, software, films, television, music. There's a whole bunch of stuff, right? So the world's a fluid place. Economic systems are fluid. If people sit there today and say China doesn't buy anything, it's not true anyway. But secondly, the challenge always is on those who create things. How do I make that attractive to whoever it is that I would like to sell whatever it is I'm selling things to, right? You know, can I enhance my attractiveness to, say, Chinese travelers by having visa-free arrangements, by building up a capacity in my tourism and services sector to support and service a group of people who generally won't speak your local language? Kind of helps, right? So these are the kinds of things that I think we will start to see unfold and expand over the next 10 to 15 years. I mean, you're in Southeast Asia. I know when you look at the data that Chinese visitations across Southeast Asia for all sorts of stuff, right, including whether it's surfing, nature, and things like that, that 20 years ago would never have been on a Chinese traveler's itinerary, right? So your parents and my parents, you know, the idea that that's why you traveled, as opposed to just taking a photograph in front of an important monument, right? That you travel for experiences, right? You know, that's not what they did. But the contemporary Chinese traveler is traveling for those sorts of things. Now, the world is replete with incredible experiences for Chinese travelers to experience, and there's great expert earners in that. So look, I'm not so stressed out or worried about the fact that as Chinese citizens get wealthier and wealthier, that they're not going to be spending more and more money on all sorts of things. I saw it in Australia, Carl, where up until the pandemic, Australia began to receive, it just tipped over 1 million Chinese travellers for the year. And Chinese travellers spent somewhere in the order of about $6,000 per person on average, which was substantially more than any other inbound tourist per capita. So,
Well, that has definitely been a very enlightening conversation, as always, with you, Professor Powell. If people, my follower, wants to find your work, where would they go?
Okay, 2 places. I'm getting better at this. Substack, warwickpowell.substack.com, and my own little channel, which is quite particular. I tend to speak to other scholars. TIO Talks with Warwick Powell, and that's, as I said, it's very focused on talking to mainly other academics, but hopefully in not too academic a way. So they're the 2 places.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Powell, for making the time to speak to us. And thanks everyone for tuning in. Until next time. Bye-bye.